In my teaching, I have been using now for the last 15 years so-called worldview framework, in which I say we have to discuss really complex issues related to sustainability in terms of the values and the beliefs which people have. And if you look at it in this way, then we can see in society, of course, quite different groups. And a very important group are the governments, who somehow have to do politics in the name of citizens. You have corporations, meaning big business, who basically are profit-oriented, and especially since neoliberalism in the 90s started, they are very profit-oriented, plus an enormous focus on shareholder value and not public interest. And then you have all the groups in society, like we as consumers and citizens. And you also, in our worldview, have groups who actually focus very much on non-material values. So we tend to forget that for maybe 2-3 billion people, religion in this world is still very important. We also tend to forget that the arts and related activities, cultural activities, are important. And what we try to do in our lecturing and publications is to say that, in fact, you should look at the middle. You should try to integrate these perspectives into solutions and policies which are robust across those groups. And in our view, what happened was, of course, that especially during the neoliberal era, which is not yet over, you saw an unbalance in the sense that corporations got more and more power. And that's understandable because given globalization, given deregulation, given privatization, you could see that the corporations, global corporations, became more and more powerful, and the power of governments gradually got eroded. So we are now in this process in which we have to rely to some extent on big global corporations for finding solutions. I'm giving next week a talk on the ethical aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals, and you see that the United Nations is trying to do an equivalent action on behalf of the governments, also at the global level. But you also see that the United Nations is not very powerful. In fact, the US, for instance, has been trying to erode the power of the United Nations already for 20 years. So I would argue that we have to find that balance again, and that balance means partly, in my view, making regional and national governments stronger again, and also maybe give citizens more opportunity to get engaged. And sometimes it also means, therefore, that corporations have to be, how to say, better controlled and be forced, for instance, to pay their taxes. Well, I think that the whole wave of privatization, deregulation, liberalization has, of course, for some sectors been a sensible move. I think if you have a very fast developing technology like mobile phones, it makes sense to give it over to the market, because the technology will then develop possibly faster and you will get better technologies, etc. But of course the whole fundamentalist market ideology, which we have developed and in which Europe has followed, in my view, look at the Lisbon agenda, that has in many ways been very harmful. Also for the whole energy transition related, climate change related topics. And the reason is simple. A number of these public services are, economists notice, are, let's say, natural monopolies. And it's very silly to think that you can give this over to the market. But this is, of course, a big ideological debate, and I think in terms of European energy policy, we clearly had, in my view, too much market. I know that when we were involved in the Kyoto negotiations, finally we gave in to the Americans to not have strict targets, but do things with emission trading. Now you could already see that the proposal here was to follow the market in trading an invisible gas with a number of countries who have, for example, totally corrupt governments. Are you surprised that we had big fraud? Are you surprised that it's not very effective if you hand out too many emission permits? So that the carbon market is not working was actually, to me, not a surprise. And maybe the European Union tries to repair this by now giving off less permits. But you may also opt for other policies which are much more stringent. And I think, apart from big business who always come up with level playing field and we have to be competitive, you have many sheltered sectors. And I think now, especially with this new president in the US, Europe should get its act together and look carefully again at effective policies. And effective policies sometimes mean that you, for the sheltered sectors, simply have tough measures and targets. And it's possible. And it might be innovation, stimulation, it might be more employment. A general remark. Climate change per se is something which has to do with greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases quickly disperse throughout the atmosphere, so it's a global issue. Yes, you know, if you emit CO2 within, I think, 24 or 48 hours, it could be anywhere on the planet. But to do something about the causes or to adapt to the impacts is always local. That's true also for something like energy transition. In Sweden and Austria, they will get their renewable energy targets. Why? Well, because they have, for example, a lot of forest. So it's much easier there to have biofuels, or at least wood. In other countries, for instance the Netherlands, it's all a little bit more tricky because we hardly have enough land and hardly any forest. So also in terms of surface, but we have maybe wind opportunities. So I think many of the targets which have been set by the individual countries are in principle achievable, as far as I know. But why is the Netherlands maybe not hitting its target? Because the politicians, even now, after the elections, always hesitate. Is it a real problem? And there are other priorities, yes, like terrorism, social security, etc., etc. So they always try to shy away from strict and stringent measures. And the same here in this country. We still have no carbon price, and it's something which is not yet under consideration. We still stick to this idea of emission trading for industry. We have privatized our housing corporations 10, 15 years ago. Now we are slowly realizing that we have to force those corporations to be involved in the massive process of insulating houses, building maybe photoelectric capacity, experiment with heat pumps, etc. The targets are certainly, technically speaking, achievable. Politically, we'll have to see. I mean, in my more skeptical moods, I always said we need much more serious impacts. I mean, an extremely hot summer, like the one in France in 2003, that would maybe wake up a number of people to say, okay, this is the way to go. And it's coming, it's around the corner, I think. And then, to answer your question, technically, most of these goals are achievable, I'm pretty sure. So we were having here one of the largest oil-related businesses in the world. And that certainly initially was, of course, a hindrance. because those people simply didn't want to believe that their business at some time would end. They had projections about more and more oil far into this century. And it took them some time to realize, especially a few years ago this started, to realize that perhaps if climate change is serious, they are ending up with stranded assets. Meaning that they have a lot of oil on their balance, but perhaps you can't sail it anymore, which is the kind of fear which the Arabs also start to have. So I think it changed with respect to oil. With respect to gas, it's a different story, because we had the largest gas field in the world, almost. Then initially it was exploited at a very high rate, partly because Shell and Exxon earned huge amounts of money and wanted to get quick money, like most corporations. But at the same time, the government thought that in the future maybe nuclear would be very cheap, so let's use the gas. Then they became more sensible in the 80s and 90s. So we still now have quite some gas, unlike the British, who really depleted it faster than anyone else. The interesting thing now is we still have now enough natural gas for the small businesses and for the consumers, but we now have this problem of earthquake risks in Groningen province. So over the past few years there is a huge pressure from the public to reduce the output from our gas fields. And that's an interesting coincidence, because it means that for totally unforeseen reason, we may now have to stop using our own gas. And of course you might argue, well, then we will import gas, but that gas might come from Russia. And politicians are much more sensitive to political issues than to climate change. I hope you understand that if I were in charge, I don't believe in one big lever which will more or less control the whole system. That's not how it works. So there is a whole series of measures probably you have to take. But one thing in this country which would help is indeed something like a carbon price. So simply become clear to people that at some point industries also have to pay, and this should be done preferably for industry at a European level. So having a clear signal that you have to pay for carbon emissions is part of the policy we need. And you might try to do it by limiting the amount of emission permits, but maybe it's much better to simply put a carbon price onto use of fossil fuels. Then you have many other measures which have much more to do with stimulating all the institutions and all the initiatives we were just talking about. For example, our housing corporations should have massive investment programs in refurbishing old houses and building low or zero energy new houses. And they do a number of things, but still you can see that our institutional investors are hesitant because there's not big money in there. And I think you have to strengthen somehow these parties, like the housing corporations, to do the right thing and to do it faster than they do it now.